Okay, hello everyone. Welcome and hello from Brussels to this webinar, Trading Partners, Rethinking Europe's Global Partnerships. My name is Anton Möller. I work for the Heinrich-Böll Foundation here in Brussels, and I'm heading the program on economic and social policy here. Before we get into today's topic on trade policy, I wanted to mention some aspects, some housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube as well, so you can watch it there afterwards as well, but also be aware, well, this webinar is being recorded. For our participants on Zoom, you're invited to raise your questions throughout the Q&A function. I'll keep a look on that and bring up your questions to the panel. Throughout the debate, we will have 4 inputs and then about 20 minutes to get into a discussion afterwards. And maybe allow me to say some words about us as Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. We are a political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party, and our primary task is political education and advocacy in Germany and abroad. We act as a think tank, and we're convening platforms to explain, analyze, and comment EU policies together with our partners from civil society. With today's webinar, we wanted to take stock on the last busy or even troublesome days in the world of trade policy. Before we do that, I would say let's rewind a little bit. Let's think about what happened. 5 years ago, the outbreak of the COVID pandemic sent shockwaves around the globe. Suddenly, long-established supply chains were under pressure. 2 years later, Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and with it the weaponization of gas, brought vulnerabilities back to the mind of political decision makers. Trade can be attacked and can be weaponized. And we can also see more recently this spring, tariffs are back in the debate. Donald Trump's administration started a global tariff debate, or tariff war, you could say. So all in all, I think these are troublesome times for trade policies, and trade policy is changing. At the same time, we see that climate change and the green transition will require that nations work together, companies work together, also through trade. Clean tech supply chains are complex and are developing in all parts of the world. And recently, as part of the Clean Industrial Deal, the European Commission seeks to position Europe as a reliable, attractive partner for the future of the clean transition worldwide. Namely, they announced new trade instruments, the Clean Trade and Investment Partnerships, a strategy that some see as promising and others raise concern over extractive practices, for example. Those instruments are currently being under negotiation with South Africa. They're being debated for an EU-India agreement. So we have quite a lot of ground to cover. The questions we wanted to raise is, what does Europe want to achieve with those partnerships? How the world reacts to these attempts in Europe, and what risks and opportunities do we see for a globally fair transition? To discuss this, we have 4 really splendid experts with us today. Cristina Miranda, who is the head of the unit for African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries at the European Commission's DG Trade and Economic Security. We are also joined by Rishabh Jain from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi, who will share his insights on the debates taking place in India. Furthermore, we run around the globe. We have with us Marcelo Mena. He's today the CEO of the Global Methane Hub, and before was the Minister of the Environment in Chile. And as a 4th expert, Claudia Azevedo is joining us from Europe Jacques Delors, a Brussels-based think tank on European affairs. Before we delve into the debate, we wanted to ask you as our participants one question. Can I ask our technical staff to bring up the Zoom poll? As part of this Clean Industrial Deal, the European Commission wants to position itself as a reliable partner for clean industries. But building partnerships require more than just trade. It requires trust. Our question to you then is, what is the most important factor for building trust with global trade partners? Is it a fairer distribution of the economic benefits? Is it to ensure investments in partner countries' infrastructure and capacity? Is it to give an equal voice in negotiations and decision-making? Or is it the implementation of strong sustainability and climate commitments? We know that you want to pick many, but you can only have one choice, because the question is, what is the most important? If you have a different opinion, you can also raise that in the Q&A. So I invite you to respond to that brief survey. All right. I cannot see how many responses were given, but I'll leave it to our technical team to decide. Okay, we have 59 responses, and we can see it's a bit of a scattered picture, but the most important aspect is actually reaping the economic benefits of trade and make that sure that this is done in a fair and equal fashion, but also the inclusion into negotiations and decision making. So to speak, the trade diplomacy matters. Those have the most views. Thank you very much. And I think with this and without further ado, I would ask Cristina Miranda to join our panel to get our debate started by sharing your insights as the head of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries unit at DG Trade of the European Commission. How is European Union's trade policy agenda shifting? What new tools are used? And lastly, do you think that these tools will help to build mutually beneficial trade? Thank you.
Many thanks, Anton, and thanks first of all to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Foundation to organize this panel and invite DG Trade. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this panel, and I would like to focus my presentation on explaining what is the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership and how this new tool will help to build mutually beneficial trade relations with third countries, particularly in the clean technology sector. I would start with a short explanation about the origin and the objectives of this new initiative, and then I will move on explaining the reasons why we have chosen South Africa as the first CITIP, and I will describe what is the CITIP approach. So on the origin and the rationale of this initiative, just to recall that the President of the European Commission announced already the CITIP initiative in her political guidelines for the new Commission that were published last summer. In that context, under the new economic foreign policy, there was a very specific remark on the need to develop a new range of clean trade and investment partnerships in order to ensure access to what we need to build diversified and resilient supply chains, and also to deepen our relations with countries that are supplying critical materials and raw materials. So the CITIP are a very fundamental part. It's one of the flagship policies announced by the new Commission, and it's part of the Clean Industrial Deal. It is, in fact, the external element of the Clean Industrial Deal, which was launched, as you know, earlier this year. And the aim of this Clean Industrial Deal is to promote decarbonization and enhance the competitiveness of the EU industry. The CITIP is embedded in the Clean Industrial Deal. It is particularly part of its fifth pillar, which is focused on global markets and international partnerships. As Anton has mentioned, the European Union has a vast network of trade agreements that ensure that European companies have better access to third markets and essential inputs. But the CITIPs will complement these agreements. These CITIPs will be faster and more flexible and more targeted approach, which are going to be tailored to the concrete business needs of the European Union and its partners. So in this sense, it fits very well with the priority that has been given in the poll that you have launched at the very beginning on the need to ensure that there is a fair distribution of benefits. And of course, this kind of tools is becoming very relevant in the context of the difficult geopolitical situation that we are operating now and that Anton has made reference to. So the CITIP will be designed to better align the EU external action with the EU industrial policy objectives, considering businesses' opportunities and needs. A very important characteristic feature of the CITIP is that they are intended to bring a whole-of-government approach to our relations with our third countries. We want to better align our engagement on different areas: trade, investment, climate, energy, and development cooperation through the Global Gateway. The CITIP focus will be on better managing strategic dependencies and securing the EU's position in crucial global value chains. by diversifying our supply chains and also securing better access to raw materials, clean energy, as well as clean technology. The intention of the CTIP is going to be to foster cooperation on energy technology and policies for the clean transition and support the decarbonization efforts in partner countries. So this CTIP is a new tool in our trade tool kit box, but there are other kind of alternative ways of engagement, like the digital trade agreement with South Korea, the MOU on critical raw materials, or the sustainable investment facilitation agreements that we have started to negotiate with third countries, and the very first one has been concluded with Angola and entered into force in September last year. So with this, I will move now to explain why we have chosen South Africa. So we have started, as you know, it has been announced at the EU-South Africa Summit earlier this year in March. It was announced by the President of the Commission and President Ramaphosa that in order to make a significant rapprochement in our relations, they decided to announce an important negotiation of a new CTIP. Also together with the decision that was announced as well in the summit of an important investment package under the Global Gateway, which is worth 4.7 billion euros. This announcement took place in a very particular moment. You are all aware of the difficult context also for South Africa as regards its relations with the US. So the reasons why we have chosen South Africa is, first of all, we have already a framework of a trade tool with South Africa. You know that the EU-SADC Economic Partnership Agreement is in place since 2016, and the main economy within this grouping is South Africa. The EPA is delivering very positive results, so we have a good starting point because of the existence of the EPA. Secondly, the European Union is the biggest trade and investment partner in sub-Saharan Africa. Our trade flows have increased significantly in the last years, and we remain the first investor in South Africa. We represent 40% of the FDI in South Africa. And the total number of European companies that have invested in South Africa has increased by 18% in 2020 to almost 1,300 in 2025. So we have the substance and we have also the volumes to make this stronger cooperation succeed. South Africa, a very important item, is a key producer of critical raw materials, particularly on the platinum group metals. We have already, with South Africa, a very close cooperation on the decarbonization agenda because of the implementation of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And of course, South Africa geopolitically is a very important country. It is a very significant player in the global south. It holds now the G20 presidency, and it has a wide influence in Africa. On top of these reasons, there was particularly a very good momentum of our relations with South Africa because of the new government of national unity that is in place after the elections in 2024. So the new government is more EU and business-friendly oriented. It is a coalition, as you know, of the ANC party that has held the government for the last 30 years, together with the Democratic Alliance party. And there is a very ambitious political priority given to the triple challenges in South Africa, which is rising poverty, inequality, and unemployment, which reaches 32% currently. So these are the reasons why we have engaged with South Africa. Since the launch of the negotiations were announced at the summit in March, we have we have worked on the content of the CTIP very intensively, and I wanted to share with you some key elements that we have in mind for this new instrument. First of all, about the form of the CTIP. We are thinking about a non-binding instrument, a memorandum of understanding. We want the form of this new instrument to be faster, lighter, more flexible, and also more targeted. As I said at the very beginning, it is very important to tailor this new instrument to the concrete business interests of the EU and South Africa. The objectives of the CTIP are, first of all, to create new trade and investment opportunities for EU companies in South Africa, while supporting the decarbonization and just transition in South Africa. We want to strengthen the competitiveness, the resilience, and the integration of clean supply chains between the EU and South Africa. And because of that, the CTIP will focus particularly on key sectors linked to the clean value chains. We have identified renewable energy and clean technologies, the electricity and transmission and the energy grid, also the clean fuels, including green hydrogen, and of course the raw materials value chain. For instance, those that are used in the battery supply chains, including the platinum metal group. Another objective of the CTIP is to make the best use of public and private financing, including through the Global Gateway. This is about the content and the objectives. We are going to discuss about the governance of the CTIP. So far, we are aiming at a very light structure, which builds up on the existing EU-South Africa strategic partnership. So we have just started 1 week ago with the talks with South Africa. We have not yet had the opportunity to have a written exchange. We are waiting for this to happen later in the coming weeks. Just to share with you what are going to be the next steps and the timeline, just to insist on the CTIP to be a demand-driven and tailor-made and project-based to ensure proper offtake of the trade and investment opportunities. We have, in that context, consulted both EU member states and the EU industry over the past weeks in order to understand better their interest and their concerns, the challenges they face when they invest in South Africa. And we are now starting, as I said, a more detailed discussion with South Africa. We hope that we will have a more stable text of the CTIP draft by the ministerial meeting of the G20, the Trade and Investment Ministerial meeting that is planned on the 10th of October. And the intention is to conclude the negotiation at the time of the G20 summit, which is taking place in South Africa on the 22nd and the 23rd of November. So before concluding my presentation, I just wanted to refer, as Anton mentioned as well, to the vast network of trade agreements. I have mentioned earlier that the CTIP is going to complement this wide network of FTAs. We are currently working to get the agreements with Mercosur and Mexico ratified, and we are continuing to advance the negotiations with Australia, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, the Eastern and Southern African region, the 5 countries in the Eastern and Southern African region we are negotiating with. And we have, as you know, recently launched negotiations with the United Arab Emirates. So with this, Anton, I think we have a good basis for discussion, and I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, for sharing the insights into the Commission's work, what the strategic objectives of CTIPs are. I'm well aware that you're negotiating the one on South Africa. And there is the announcement after the last EU-India summit that there will be negotiations with India as well. And I'm very happy to welcome on the stage now Rishabh Jain from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi, who works on resource use and climate policy in India. And after you heard now what the Commission is setting out to do in their negotiations with the EU-South Africa agreement. And knowing that there will be negotiations with India, I would be very curious to hear what your thoughts about that are, what your hopes for this process are, and eventually to circle back to our initial question, do you think this is a risk for resource use because it might be exploitative, or is it an opportunity to build clean tech industries in India?
Right. Thank you, Anthony, again for the invitation and for a very timely panel discussion. I think there is a much need across the world to actively continue discussing on some of the topics that you are trying to bring up to the discussion today. And through these dialogues and discussion, hopefully find solutions to the problems that are very, very evident across the world. So I'm Rishabh Jain, and I'm representing the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are a non-profit policy research institution based in New Delhi, India, actively working in the field of climate change and sustainability. A lot of the work that I do revolves around energy transition, manufacturing, supply chain, and trade, critical minerals included. And in the last couple of years, specifically after COVID, what we have realized, both in India and outside, there has been efforts to indigenize the supply chains. This is one particular approach that countries across the world have taken. The other approach is also how do you get or maybe design supply chains or be part of supply chains that are more reliable. So these have been the broader motives in which many countries are operating in. And this is the same case that we have witnessed in India also. In the last 3 to 5 years, the government has put in $10 to $12 billion of financial support to develop clean energy value chains in India. In some cases, the indigenization levels that are expected are up to 90%, specifically in the solar. In some cases, it is 30 to 40%. Beyond the fiscal support, the government has come up with many different missions. I'll give you some examples. More recently, the government came up with the National Critical Minerals Mission. Then there was National Hydrogen Mission. In the recent budget, we announced the National Manufacturing Mission. There are certain trade barriers that were removed. There are duties that were removed, but also duties that were implemented in some cases to ensure that the domestic manufacturers are supported. I mean, in some cases where products were being dumped in India, we had to protect domestic manufacturers in this particular case. While all of this is happening on the supply side, what we've also seen that India has constantly tried to raise its ambition towards clean energy transition. So we have as a country announced 2070 net zero, given that we are a developing country and we expect to continue with a population of 1.4 billion people, that the energy demands will increase. So expecting that the peaking year will be around 2040 with 2070 net zero. At the same time, we are expecting to deploy 500 plus gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030 itself. So these are non-fossil capacity. But as our NDC targets, we also say 50% of our power capacity will be non-fossil sources. I'm sharing all of this context because when I was seeing the kind of people who would be joining, there may be a certain perception or understanding of the country. So I think that I just wanted to share. Now, while the ambitions are there, both on the supply and the demand side, it is easier said than done. All of us, I mean, Europe also has huge, very, very good ambitions. India also has very good ambitions, and there are a few other countries that have ambitions that we can learn from. But if every country tries to do it on its own, everything, it will take decades and decades from where we are. There are learnings from deployment. There are learnings in manufacturing. There are learnings in critical mineral processing. There are learnings how we collect the data, how we skill people, how we build infrastructure. And that is where I think the more we collaborate within a country, between countries, between regions, we will be able to solve for it. And I think there is a clear urgency that exists in India and few countries that climate change is a problem that is acceptable across political parties. It does not necessarily matter which political party is in power. Everyone understands that people are being impacted by climate change in different ways. It may be flooding, heat, and different forms in which it comes, fires, etc. And there is a need to solve for it. And I think there's also a clarity that it will take time. We cannot just immediately shut down certain power projects. because electricity being very, very important. So it will take time. The transition will take time, but there are certain baby steps to large steps that we need to take. I'll come to on the supply side, on the trade barriers that we have seen in the last 6 months. But of course, there have been discussions on trade barriers since last decade, and when it started between China and Japan for rare earth, but we have more recently also seen rare earth export limitations from China for the magnets itself. Um, there is no doubt that we have globally become more and more dependent on China for components and products. There is no doubt about that. And I'm also not saying that we have become dependent. I would say there are two reasons why we have become dependent. One, we have over the years deprioritized development of technology and manufacturing in many of the regions because these products were available in a cheaper rate from imports, and in the globalized world, we expected that wherever it is produced more efficiently, let's import. This was the broader thinking in a simple lay form. But more recently, when we saw the concern started arising on the weaponization, when we are too much dependent. So, in one of the studies that we released in 2023 for India during India's G20 presidency, we saw that for solar, wind, and batteries, the low income and low middle income countries were increasingly witnessing concentrated supply chains with HHI greater than 0.25 in their imports of solar and battery technologies. This means that if something were to happen to their imports, they will have no other place to go instead of one country. So if the prices increase, they have to pay the same price, and if the supply is shut, they just don't know where to go. And I think as global leaders and as emerging global leaders, there are a certain set of responsibilities that many countries have, including EU, India, US, couple of others, that how do we in the long term, not in the short term, in the long term, how do we envision the supply chain to be like? And the supply chain may or may not be concentrated. I don't think necessarily that is a big problem. The problem is it should be reliable at the end of the day, where you can say that tomorrow a country will not necessarily cut off the supply of EV, of batteries, of magnets, of materials, just because there is some problem, or maybe there are possibilities of any problem. And I think once that is sorted, I think it's okay to import from wherever it is available efficiently. And this is where I think, given the demography of India and how India is planning and the partnerships that it has showcased, India presents a good opportunity. That is where India is also thinking that we have a huge market that is upcoming, a big workforce that exists in India. Of course, the technology needs to be developed, and that is where the partnerships with European countries become very, very critical and very important. There has, I would say, in the 90s, in the 80s, even in the 2000s, India and EU, there have been very, very successful partnerships. It started with on the wind energy sector, specifically with Denmark, Netherlands, etc., on how do we deploy wind power in India. And then we have had very successful, very good partnerships with countries like France and Germany on solar later. And we jointly have developed some of these technologies. Some of these companies, Indian companies, have gone and invested there, and similar European companies have come and invested in India. There's already a lot of institutional memory that exists. But over the years, because many of these companies were unable to scale up or faced many of these challenges, their ambitions were cut down. Now, how do we continue to revive them? How do we push them? Is something that the governments in EU and India need to actively think. And a good starting point is, of course, the trade negotiations, but there's so much more that we need to do beyond. I think there is a clear understanding, I think, that is needed, where we say that if we do or if we try to solve the problems collectively, we'll become stronger collectively, and we'll also be able to achieve some of the outcomes that we intend to in a shorter period of time. I'll give you a few examples again. For instance, on the critical minerals processing, the ecosystem is fairly nascent. The government has come up with a $2 billion USD $2 billion scheme earlier this year to develop the ecosystem. It has everything from mining, exploration, processing, recycling, etc. There's similarly $2 billion domestic solar manufacturing mission, PLI scheme and then on the batteries itself. But there are companies that exist in Europe. They have developed some of these technologies. There are German and other companies who have some of these technologies. It may be for recycling, for anode, cathode, some of the new battery technologies, even for solar. The boundaries are being pushed. But how do we commercialize it? Where do we test it? Maybe in the existing facilities, etc. India can be a very good place where some of these technologies are tested and even sometimes co-developed itself. We have in India big R&D team of many wind manufacturers across the world. They may not be manufacturing in India, but they have a huge R&D team sitting in India. European wind manufacturers. They some of the semiconductor design also happens in India, one of the largest there. So how do we leverage some of these capabilities to solve for it is important. There's also, I think, in the recent past, when we have been actively supporting the government on some of these documents, schemes, etc., we often look forward to what has the thinking on some of these ambitions been in Europe. So we look forward to what are the kind of regulations or policies that EU countries or even at a European Commission level have been implemented. And wherever we see things can be adapted to India, we have tried to suggest that, okay, there are learnings here because I know that there are a lot of discussions that happen in the background and it's always better to learn. But I think there is, instead of us or an independent institution talking about it, I think there's more that governments can actively discuss, share their learnings. There are many new policies that will be developed. There are a lot of technical institutions supported by the government that are doing active R&D. For instance, in India, CSIR labs, but in Europe also there are a lot of these technical labs, including Fraunhofer and others, who are trying to develop new products, new technologies, new processes for either solar, wind, batteries, as I said, for many of these technologies. How do we link them in a way that these are not piecemeal? These are institutionalized processes. How do we co-develop standards? How do we co-develop transparency mechanisms? One of the things that have more recently become very important globally is that the traceability of the products continues. So I think developing some of these together will be very important. So I'll stop here. Anton, happy to take on more questions, suggestions later. But I think the more we talk about it, the more ideas and thoughts will come between India and EU. And hopefully, sooner than later, we'll be able to formalize many of these partnerships, either at G2G level or between independent institutions and industry. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Rishabh, for sharing the idea that cooperation can be helpful for companies, but also in standard setting and for governments. I think that's a very crucial element. We are running around the globe in this webinar, really. And our next speaker is, I think, joining us from London, but he's initially from Chile. Marcelo, if I can ask you up on the stage. Marcelo works as the CEO of the Global Methane Hub and was the Minister for the Environment in Chile. And I think this gives you two very interesting perspectives on methane supply chains, but also as an environmentalist, how do you think about this trade and clean tech discussion that we're having here? And I would ask you to keep it at about 8 minutes so we have some space for debate later.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned that, yeah, environmentalist is what environment ministers should be, and always, and that's the difference between being effective and not. So the first thing I wanted to say is that anti-trade visions on the environment sometimes are based out of ignorance of what is required, really, and sometimes hijacked by anti-trade arguments masked as environmental arguments. And I just wanted to show you a little bit of the Chile history on that, with trade agreements and the evolution. So once we recovered democracy in 1990, we started signing free trade agreements with different countries, with Canada, with the US, in which we started to establish mechanisms to improve environmental compliance. When the World Bank started issuing safeguards, it caused us to establish an environmental impact assessment system that started in the 90s. When we accessed the OECD, that also improved our regulatory frameworks. And when you talk about like the growth of anti-globalization, both on the far left and the far right, this has really changed and caused some really unlikely allies. So for example, Chile was negotiating the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and supporting what then was the Obama administration to this. And then when Trump gets elected, he wants to pull out of this agreement. Chile rescued the agreement along with other Pacific nations, but it was opposed internally by the far left too. So you had very unlikely allies of the far left and far right with very disinformed visions of what the trade agreement really envisioned. With the EU and Chile, we also had similar history with for a short while, we had a vice minister that had an anti-trade vision, and that was actually overcome by evidence, both on TPP and the European Union one, and which we were able to enhance our collaboration on environmental issues, including very explicit acknowledgement of the Paris Agreement and the biodiversity conventions. And in case of Canada, for example, we were able to also present our own values, expanding, for example, gender perspective in our updated trade agreement. And so that's something that it also indicates that you could show your own values. And another thing I wanted to say is that around the same time that we wanted to negotiate the TPP in the Bachelet administration, we're also leading a similar agreement that was called the Escazú Agreement, which is the first environmental justice agreement in Latin America, mirroring the Aarhus Agreement. And here we also saw this sort of anti-globalization, anti-collaboration, anti-multilateralism pendulum swing. So we try to support it. The Piñera administration opposes it. Costa Rica was a champion, and once it pushes it, the new administration is anti-globalization and opposes it. But still, the agreement, luckily, is ratified and is working, and is also helping, the way that I would say to my peers, leveling the playing field, because you have environmental impact assessment requirements, public participation requirements, access to information requirements, and access to environmental justice. And in the case of the Escazú Agreement, protections for environmental defenders who are under threat in the Latin American region above other regions. And so therefore, this multilateralism approach can also help induce in progress and level the playing field of environment issues. So other things that we were able to do, for example, carbon pricing, we expanded the approach in the region, having an agreement to collaborate with Canada, with Mexico, with Colombia, with Peru, with California. And so, of course, then when the CBAM is presented, we were ready, we supported it, we believed it was to level the playing field globally. And so therefore, we are prepared for the CBAM overall. I also wanted to say that every country and region has contradictions. The EU wasn't always a leader. For example, when we had a tax on emissions, we had very strong opposition from European car manufacturers that wanted to promote their technologies, and so therefore, and this has come both to a negative impact on the air quality of European cities and a very vulnerable manufacturing system to clean technologies like EVs. So I just wanted to say that but every region has its contradictions. But I just wanted to finally reflect that open markets allow access to the cheapest technology at the fastest rates. Latin America has benefited from this. We've got 70% renewable energy in the region, 5 years in advance of a COP25 target. So 70%, which is the highest rate on any continent. We have the largest fleets of electric buses outside of China, Santiago, Sao Paulo, Bogota, and unfortunately, there's not any European cities or American cities in that list because you have self-limited to accessing the cleanest technologies overall. And so open markets and no tariffs also continue to help deploy more renewable energy. And just wanted to contrast, for example, the cost of residential solar in India at $0.7 per watt, Chile $1 per watt, and the US $3 per watt. And if you extend this, so essentially you have a subsidy-heavy, expensive, market distorting mechanism and giving the wrong impression that renewable energy is expensive when it's not. And this is also going into battery storage. Chile and India have levelized cost of energy of solar and battery storage at $50 per megawatt, which is cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas, cheaper than oil. And so therefore, that's where we're seeing so much progress in that region. I just wanted to finalize talking about the methane import standard that European Union has helped establish. So natural gas has lower emissions than coal if we ignore everything else. Depending on how much methane is leaked, it can look a lot more like coal. So whether I get, for example, my oil and gas from the Permian Basin in the US, which has 3% leakage rate, it actually is very similar to coal in total emissions. If I get it from Qatar, it will be much lower, much closer. And so that's why the European Union in its transition wanted to consider this. Same goes for Chile. I led the coal phase out agreement of power generation. I had a conversation with the minister said, well, we could replace it with natural gas. Well, it depends on where that natural gas is coming from. And so that's why this European Union import standard, which is not presented as a trade agreement, has trade impacts that are significant and that are important, because this allows to tackle emissions that represent roughly 16% of total emissions for the European Union that actually are imported from the oil and gas that they are bringing. And so therefore, if you use that lever, you're able to extend the influence. And so therefore, one of the most important things that the European Union can do is keep those standards in place. And that's why we are so happy that this was survived the pressure to get rid of these rules, because it's cost effective, it's market sensitive, it's market based, it actually is an economic way to tackle climate change. So as this has survived, Japan has the same issue, Korea has the same issue, China also has the same issue. And if we use trade, we can create a buyers and seller market that actually the major oil and gas producers support. Canada, Australia, and before the last election, the US. And so therefore now, even though the US got rid of the rules, if they want to access the European market, they have to reduce emissions roughly 90%, which shows that we have created in this a geopolitical system of regulations that survive these external pressures and can withstand the efforts that it can maintain the efforts that we need to be in the long term, because we cannot have climate action depend on who is governing. It needs to be fundamentally correct. And what was presented here was a good approach. And so do not be surprised if you have other groups like the Latin American region joining in these approaches. And that's what the Methane Hub is helping do. And the good thing about it is that we could track these reductions from space. So these are not self-reported. The Global Methane Hub has supported the different satellite constellations and the enforcement mechanism that the European Union is envisioning for these purposes. And so finally, I just wanted to say that protectionism limits action, but it also provides two wrong signals to the developing world: that climate action is expensive, and that you need to spend a lot of money, and that money is countries just simply do not have. And therefore, what they'll ask is, well, where's the 130 billion a year? And that's not the right connection, because if you do it correctly, how much climate finance did Chile get for this? Very little. It was the private sector that was done through unlocking trade, incorporating externalities. And that's the way to really deploy. And that's the example of Latin America, but also of India, that have been using these tools. And so the second thing is that you hoard technology and you create inflation. So if you put in $100 billion in electrolyzers in a year, you make electrolyzers first off be deployed only in your region, leaving the access to the technology somewhere else. It makes things more expensive. And so therefore, what happens? A new government comes in, wants to get rid of all the subsidies, and all you left was a legacy of expensive technology when you could have had the markets do the fastest way to deploy this technology. So that's my comment on linking trade and environment and what the European Union has been able to leverage with its leadership. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I think you raised quite some crucial things here, right? On the question if trade policy instruments are actually helping to govern global supply chains, etc., more than enabling them. So I think there's a lot to unpack in it. I saw there was one question in the chat that I'll try to pose in my question to Claudia, who will join us next. The question in the chat was, what can companies do under CTIP that they can't do already? And I think this is a twofold interesting question, because it opens up the question, well, are we negotiating CTIPs with partners where we already have really good terms and conditions? So what is the benefit? And also, if we look at the sectoral focus of clean trade and investment partnerships, what is actually then the benefit, not just for companies, but also for the green transition in Europe and beyond? So maybe, Claudia, you can elaborate.
Thank you, Anton, for the invitation, and thanks to all of the speakers that came before me that made my job much easier. So I'll try to be brief, because I know we're running out of time. But maybe I can start from why we at Europe Jacques Delors decided to work on the CTIPs. Because I mean, obviously, the previous speakers touched upon everything going on at the political level at this point in time with the US and so on. But there is another layer when it comes to the EU's relations with third countries, especially in the global South, because in the context of the Green Deal, with all of our climate measures like the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the deforestation regulation and so on, which are measures with an extraterritorial impact, they triggered quite a lot of tension, and partner countries raised quite a lot of concerns around the extraterritorial implications of these measures. So it's something that we at Europe Jacques Delors have been following for the past 2 years. And when we saw the CTIP being announced in the political guidelines, we're like, maybe this could be a vehicle to step up collaboration and to rebuild trust with our partners in the global South. And of course, what's happening at the geopolitical level makes everything even more prominent. And then we also believe that, you know, these CTIPs can fulfill a critical gap in the EU's toolbox, because as Christina mentioned, the EU already has several tools to engage with third countries. But then we have, on the one hand, the FTA, so hopefully the CTIPs will be more agile and more flexible than an FTA. But then hopefully as well, they will bring something more substantial to the table than other soft tools like the Memorandum of Understanding on raw materials and so on. So this is where we think that the CTIPs could bring something to the table if it manages to strike this balance between having something concrete, but still being agile and hopefully not taking decades to negotiate. So now the question is, what can it bring new to the table? And I mean, obviously, I'll focus on the sustainability dimensions of it, because it's the angle through which I normally work on these topics. And we at Europe Jacques Delors just published a couple of months ago a paper on the CTIPs with a menu of policy options, really looking at what these partnerships could look like from the design to the implementation. So I will not go into detail on this. But I think one key aspect of this CTIP is really to what extent does it lead to value addition in third countries? To what extent does it will it promote or help our partner countries also achieve their industrial ambitions? And it goes back to the poll at the beginning of our webinar, right? About to what extent will it lead to benefits also to our partners, and obviously ideally would lead to new projects banked by the global gateway when it comes to building and upgrading facilities, for instance, for local refining, processing, recycling, but also to other things, right? The way we see it, it should also come with commitments around capacity building, even tech transfer, really, when it comes to waste management for mining waste, which is something quite critical, and so on. And I mean, we do understand that it's challenging, right, to build the political support within the EU also to support green industries outside of the EU at a time when we are also trying to boost our own domestic industries. But I think the way we see it, I mean, obviously it's really good for supply chain resilience, right? To help bring new players into the market. It is basically will help raw material supply chains becoming more resilient. And of course, like, it will be hard to overcome the dominance of China in many of these supply chains. But I think the CTIPs could play a big role in bringing other new players to the market, not just EU players, but players outside of the EU. And then, of course, when it comes to sustainability, I mean, obviously the CTIPs will not match or will most likely not match the level of sustainability commitments that we normally would see in the context of an FTA, Trade and Sustainable Development chapter in an FTA. And probably it shouldn't really, because it's a more targeted deal. So what we're calling for is for it to include targeted sustainability commitments tailored to the sectors that it covers, right? So for instance, when we're talking about mining, things linked to land use and deforestation will be particularly important. Requirements of mandatory environmental and social impact assessments, reference to international frameworks like the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible mineral supply chains, the UN guiding principles, all of these things are voluntary frameworks, right? But I think especially at a time where we see our own due diligence laws under attack here in Europe, it would be quite important to include these references in the deals. And then obviously it's not just about the commitments that go in there, but also the consequences that these deals lead in practice, right? Because we're all very familiar with the sustainability implications of mining and even things like green hydrogen that are really water intensive and energy intensive and so on. But I think perhaps one element that I find particularly interesting in the CTIPs has to do with regulatory cooperation. I think it bears quite a lot of potential, not only as a vehicle to facilitate and to step up dialogue on the EU's autonomous measures on CBAM, on issues like carbon pricing. That is a discussion going on also in South Africa, but also other things like the battery regulation in the EU that will have an impact on countries with artisanal and small-scale mining that might face trade barriers linked to traceability, if traceability and due diligence systems are not in place. And also when it comes to harmonization of standards, which is something that Draghi, for instance, brings up in the Draghi report, and I think it could serve as a vehicle for a dialogue on harmonization of technical standards on things like EVs and EV batteries and so on. But now answering to the question in the chat, which is a very, very valid one, and it's something that we ask ourselves all the time here at Jacques Delors, is I think we should manage our expectations when it comes to what these CTIPs can deliver, because at least at a first stage, they are a non-binding tool. And I do understand why the Commission decided to go with something non-binding, because on the one hand, there is an economic partnership agreement already with South Africa. And I mean, if we want to move fast, I mean, time is not on our side, right? So to move fast, we might need to go with something non-binding. But I think we should also not exclude the possibility of these deals becoming binding over time, because there are several benefits to that when it comes to enforceability, but also predictability, reliability for businesses that one of the speakers, I believe it was Richard, brought up as well, when it comes to securing even long-term key inputs for the EU businesses long term. So I think it's an option that should be on the table for these deals to become legally binding over time. Or at least part of these deals. And we've seen this in the context, for instance, of digital trade agreements that started as, a set of principles and then eventually evolved into something with more teeth. And then also it could really just lead to, for instance, revisiting the underlying legal frameworks, right? So in the case of South Africa, the EU-SADC Economic Partnership Agreement dates back to 2016. So perhaps this could be a first step towards a future revision. I mean, obviously, it's not just with South Africa, right? Christina mentioned it as well. It's with the SADC group of countries, so it doesn't depend just on South Africa, but that could be another outcome. And I will conclude in 1 minute, Anton, I promise. But I just want to say to make 2 points, because I think it's one key aspect of the CTIPs that I think it was really missing in the previous mandate, is really this alignment of the trade, investment, and development agenda. And we also see like an EU external action more and more aligned with our own trade and investment interests, which isn't necessarily something bad. And there's a very interesting study by CDPM that shows that actually trading partners don't perceive this more transparency around like the EU interests behind our international action as something negative. What they often their concerns often have to do with the perceived inconsistency and double standards. And I think we also have to be very realistic when we think about what the CTIPs can achieve for sustainable development, because this come at a time where we at home, our green measures like the CSDDD and even EUDR to a certain extent are under threat, right? So when we are watering down, or if our current simplification packages leads to a watering down of our regulation, then obviously this will impact our stance at international level, and we have to be realistic on what we can demand from our partners from these deals. And then one last point is, I think the biggest challenge going forward will be to make the case to engage with the countries with which there is no direct geostrategic or economic interest, really, the LDCs of this world, because the CTIPs obviously are, we do see an enormous potential, but they will not probably be the right tool to engage with these countries. It's more like for these big emerging economies. So I think as we start now the discussions around the budget, it will be important to keep in mind that great that we're pursuing all of this agenda with these big emerging economies in the global south, but we need to find new tools to engage with those countries, like the LDCs. But I will stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Claudia. We are almost running out of time, but at least I want to invite all the panelists on our stage. Thank you very much. And take 5 minutes. I'll take the liberty to steal some of your time to just give you the chance to react to the different aspects that were mentioned, because I realized we talked about a lot of regions, a lot of topics, etc. But I would just ask you to give me like a 1-minute statement per person. What did you take away from this debate? And I would start in the same order with Christina, if you want.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anton. Extremely interesting discussion. Many thanks to the rest of the speakers. I would like to make 4 points. First, on the non-legally binding nature of the city. I want to underline that we should not underestimate the value and the importance of cooperation, even if there are no legally binding commitments. We think that this cooperation will have an instrumental role to play in order to facilitate the business climate in which our companies operate. And it will have an impact on scaling up the mobilization of funding that would be channeled to these projects we are going to discuss together with South Africa. A second important element, I already mentioned it, but I think it has to be very much kept in mind when we conclude, is this whole of government approach about the CTIP. So the CTIP will bring all of our bilateral work with South Africa in clean sectors together under one coherent and flexible framework. It means that we will discuss with South Africa about investment, regulatory cooperation, barriers to trade and investment, questions on demand security under one single roof. And this is, I think, going to be very impactful. The third point is about the question to what extent this is going to benefit to South Africa compared to what already exists now. For these reasons that I have already mentioned, we think that this instrument will increase the interest of European companies to invest in South Africa as long as we facilitate the business environment. And a very important aspect is that we are going to focus on local value addition. So we want South Africa to benefit from this partnership in the sense that we would allow industry to move higher up in the global supply chain and advance South Africa decarbonization ambition. And then the last point is insist again that this is going to be a bottom-up and demand-driven approach. And in that context, engagement with the business is going to be essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rishabh, I'd ask you, and I'd also ask you to be very crisp in your answer.
Yes, I think Christina has already covered a lot that I wanted to say, but I'll focus on 2 points only. One is patience and the other is trust. Patience because the problems that we are trying to solve, including climate change, technology, building supply chains, resilience, industry, will take time. And we need to have a long-term approach. We should not be thinking short-term. And that is where I think trust also becomes important. Any partnership, a long-term partnership, cannot be successful without an underlying trust. So there may have been failures in the past. We may have not been successful, but I still think we need to start with an approach that we'll trust each other, we'll figure out how to work better with each other, despite many differences, including culture, how we work. So I think with patience and trust, we'll be able to solve the problems specifically on climate change and supply chain indigenization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was indeed very quick. Marcelo, I'd ask you, what's your takeaways?
Yeah, it's important to not overburden the transition to things that we did not burden the status quo with. If we do not change today, the fossil fuel industry will be stronger than ever. It will continue to pollute. And there is a false narrative that this transition could become an extractivism 2.0 that will cause environmental impacts. It's certainly different when you have 2,000 liters of oil being used every car versus one-time extraction and that's recyclable in the case of EVs. It's absolutely different to have solar panels and it's different and it's not a sacrifice zone as being living in places with oil and gas refineries and coal power pollution. So I just wanted to highlight that because when we are doing this, we are actually lending ourselves to the narratives of the fossil fuel industry that do not want any change. And I just wanted to highlight that. There is one word that we miss here, trade-off. And this is something we need to consider down the line because if we overburden, we only make the transition slower and we need to reduce emissions very fast. And those who will pay are actually the communities that we say we defend.
Thank you very much. And Claudia, to you back.
I'll try to be very brief. Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe to pick up on what Christina said on the non-binding, because I do think that even if it's non-binding, it can bring something new. And I mean, even just rebuilding the trust and what Christina said about like coordinating efforts, it's really important because if we see the amount of EU initiatives that exist in South Africa at the moment, it's pretty, well, it's amazing, but it can also lead to duplication of efforts really quickly. There's like an energy dialogue, there's the JET-P, a green hydrogen mission, there's the EPA, right? So there's just so many things, discussions on carbon pricing. So I think if the CTIP really manages to channel all of these things under like this umbrella framework, it is great. And I think when we talk about non-binding instruments, I think the monitoring implementation is the most important really, because I mean, we really want to hear, I mean, we saw for instance with the raw materials partnerships, I mean, the implementation and the monitoring, I mean, it's not really transparent. So they raised quite a lot of doubts among civil society organizations as to if they delivered. So I think, for instance, I'm not saying that it should duplicate the existing tools that already exist in the context of the economic partnership agreement. There's, for instance, an implementation committee and so on, but maybe things like considering an implementation committee in the context of the CTIPs with roadmaps that are public or by sector, and some sort of mechanism for civil society and private sector consultation throughout, and even things like complaints mechanisms that already exist in the EU, for instance, like the single entry point, trying to extend that to things like the CTIP. I think it could go a long way to, yeah, sending a signal to civil society that, you know, you can still contribute to this new tool, that it's not an FTA, but, you know, it's something that will keep existing going forward. So, and I think the other thing is really we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the FTA negotiations that are ongoing. I mean, obviously we all focused a bit on the CTIPs, but when we talk about resources for the transition, like countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, all of, I mean, India, they will be very, very important. And there it's going to be very challenging to try to find a compromise between the EU accessing resources that it needs and our partners' own industrial ambitions that we've heard, for instance, from Rishab when it comes to India. So yeah, I will keep my eyes open to see how those things evolve.
All right, thank you very much. I know we're running out of time, so I think the last thing that remains for me to say is I see there are more questions in the Q&A. I have many more questions about this topic, so I'll take this as a segue to invite everyone to sign up for a newsletter, because us as Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we will obviously be working on this. We will keep following these negotiations. And I very briefly want to thank our offices in New Delhi and in Santiago de Chile that helped me organizing this webinar, that helped with the contacts. So if you sign up to the Böll's newsletter, you will also get information from all parts of the world, as we are a global network. And very finally, thank you very much to our audience and to our panelists for joining today. And I wish you a very nice afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon,
Thanks
everyone.
a lot. Good afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.